This is my house.
This week, I've watched two movies to review them. The Zack Snyder movie Rebel Moon Part 2 The Scargiver and the new Sydney Sweeney movie Immaculate. Sydney Sweeney plays a nun in it.
Nuns! Nuns! Reverse! 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 Reverse!
And a nun outfit is not very flattering on her. And should you, in my view, watch either of them? It's tricky to say, because a lot of it will depend on you and what you like. Before I get into spoilers, I would probably give Rebel Moon a miss altogether, unless you really like sci-fi or Zack Snyder, because on balance I found it to be even worse than part 1 of Rebel Moon that I didn't like either. But I was on the edge of my seat for the grain harvesting scene. But I'll get to why in a separate review. I also covered Sydney Sweeney being a hate magnet in a separate video. As for Immaculate, it's a quite promising horror movie that does very well until the last third, where it goes off the rails a bit. It also may be possibly the worst date movie I've ever seen. Take a woman to see this, and it may well result in you getting kicked in the knackers. Sydney Sweeney plays a young nun in it, the whole thing takes place in a convent in Italy, and it has themes of the bad guys of the movie being the Roman Catholic Church, and it has a strong allegory for women getting rid of unwanted pregnancies. Even post-birth, and it goes to quite uncomfortable lengths to justify it. The whole film is quite feminist, and anti-male as well. So yes, if you're going for a date night, maybe skip this one, unless you want to have what's probably going to be a very uncomfortable conversation afterwards. If as a guy you take a girlfriend to this movie, the chances of you getting any affection afterwards are frankly slim to none. It's essentially a film-based prophylactic, but maybe give it a go if you really like horror or Sydney Sweeney. Maybe give it a miss if you don't like those things, or be outraged by its treatment of the church or pregnancy, or making men look frankly like demons. There's not a single favourable male character in the whole film. In the movie, Sydney Sweeney plays a young American woman who's decided to become a nun and join a convent in Italy. Her character doesn't speak much Italian. The film was shot in Rome. They made the convent in the movie out of a few separate places, reportedly buildings in Rome called Villa Parisi and Palazzo Doria Pamphile. And I had to look up how to pronounce the second one, because for some reason Italy ended up with a random silent J there at the end, and it's still not as bad as Leicester. And don't even get me started on Wales and these place names. The sets in Immaculate are beautiful. That and the feeling of alienation from being an outsider in a foreign country, and the cast mostly being women, reminded me quite favourably of the Dario Argento horror movie Suspiria from 1977. Sadly, Immaculate doesn't really match Suspiria for quality. Suspiria also has a lone young American woman abroad, this time in Freiburg in Germany in a ballet school. Though Immaculate takes a lot more subtle approach than Suspiria did, for better or worse. I liked Suspiria a lot, but some people find its heavy use of colour and sound to be too much. Overall, I found Immaculate to be a worthwhile film. There was plenty of material in there for Sydney Sweeney to get her teeth into, and she pulled out quite an impressive performance for me, showing a good emotional range. Apart from anger again, which she seems to do by just screaming at the camera. So give it a go if you like horror. You could do a lot worse, but it's far from perfect, and some faults show up in the last third. From here on in, I'll be getting into spoilers. The movie opens up in said convent with a young nun trying to escape. She steals a set of keys in the middle of the night and makes a break for it, but is ultimately caught by what I had to look up, and supposedly a group of nuns is called a superfluity. The woman squeezes through a gate, and damn! What have they been feeding those nuns? She slapped her leg bone like a toothpick. Okay, are the nuns supposed to be superpowered in this film or something? I do hope they in some way explain that later. Spoiler, they don't. The young woman wakes up screaming in a sealed coffin and presumably meets a very bad end, with altogether too much female screaming for my comfort. I don't like the sound of women screaming. I don't like the sound of anyone screaming in agony, really. There's a lot of that in the film, but it's a horror, and it was an effective way to start the film, although it does give away that Sydney Sweeney is heading into a very bad situation, and it could have been more effective if we'd got to spend more time with the nun from the opening scene. She's essentially a red shirt. The opening would have been more effective for me if we got to spend some time getting to know her first. The film then switched POV to Sydney Sweeney arriving in Italy and being leered at by the border guards, who think her becoming a nun is a waste. A nun outfit does not exactly bring the best out of Sydney Sweeney, but that's hardly the point anyway. She's at first happy with her new life in the convent. She makes a friend in another young Italian nun who's a bit wild, and she gets a lot of hatred from an older superior nun who seems to take an instant dislike to her, but she settles into the normality of a new life, caring for the elderly nuns. She takes her vows and goes to her room, where she hears strange noises. She follows the noise to find a very strange masked nun lying prostrate on a floor. She's then shown the convent's most prized possession, an iron nail that it's claimed was used to crucify Jesus. The weird nun was seemingly praying to it, and as Sydney Sweeney touches it, she passes out. And this is when the film starts to take a turn. She starts to feel ill in the days following, and sick, and consults the convent's doctor. And this is when she learns that she, despite being a virgin, is with child, and is questioned quite harshly by the priests, who finally conclude that, like Mary, she's been chosen by God to be a vessel for the second coming of Christ. She is from that point treated with reverence by most of the nuns, apart from her friend, who thinks that something untoward is going on. She's treated well by the other nuns, until the elder nun, who disliked her from earlier, tries to drown her in a bathtub, while screaming, "It was supposed to be me," in Italian. The elder nun is dragged away, and later accidentally falls off quite a high roof. This effectively turns her head into pate, and Sweeney's young nun friend speaks out about how none of this is right, and is also dragged away. Sydney Sweeney then wakes up in the middle of the night, and goes to try and find her friend, and when she does, she finds her being tortured by another nun and having her tongue cut out. At this point, Sydney Sweeney decides that staying in this convent does not appear to be in her best interests any longer. She uses chicken blood to fake a problem with the baby in the hopes of being taken to a local hospital, where she can make her escape, and it almost works. She's in the car on the way to the hospital with two priests, when one of the nuns finds the remains of the chicken, and she gets caught after she tries to run. From this point on, she's a prisoner. And then the film takes a very weird turn that for me really needed more work, because the up to now very violence averse young nun, the young sweet nun who could barely hurt a chicken earlier in the movie, essentially turns into Charles Bronson from a Michael Winner film. She smashes a nun's head in with a cross, strangles a priest with rosary beads, and finds out the secret of the convent, that one of the priests was a former scientist who's been using his skills and DNA that was found on the crucifixion spike to try and birth the second coming of Christ, using the nuns as incubators. Sydney Sweeney, even though heavily pregnant, sets the lab on fire and gets the priest in the neck with the spike. She then escapes through the convent's catacombs, gives birth in a forest in a quite unpleasant scene with a lot more female screaming, and finds she's given birth to an abomination that she then drops a heavy rock on while screaming again. I'm kind of fed up of childbirth scenes after House of the Dragon, and it isn't much of a happy ending for the film, is it? It was a film for me that did a lot right. It could have done more to earn the nun's apparent super strength early in the film. Also, why Sydney Sweeney suddenly turned into the Punisher 2/3 of the way through, and the ending was more than a little awkward and kind of left me with a bad taste in my mouth. Usually horror is quite a good movie genre for a date night. Something about the fear makes cuddling very fun, but I stress again, this may be the worst date night movie I've ever seen. Maybe give it a go, but not for that, unless you want your date to start giving you very angry looks.
Of course!
Never rub another man's rhubarb.
And Bob Iger's like, "No, master,